This is my kitchen table and also my filing system. Over much of the past 3 decades, I've been an investor. The highest calling of mankind, I've often thought, was private equity. And then I started interviewing.
While I watch your interviews, I know how to do some interviewing.
I've learned in doing my interviews how leaders make it to the top.
I asked him how much he wanted. He said $250. I said, fine. I didn't negotiate with him, and I did no due diligence.
I have something I'd like to sell, and how they stay there. You don't feel inadequate now because being only the second wealthiest man in the world, is that right? One of the most successful IPOs in 2025 was the IPO of Circle, a regulated stablecoin network. The company was the brainchild of Jeremy Allaire. I recently had a chance to sit down with Jeremy Allaire to talk about what a regulated stablecoin network is and why it's the future of banking. The company has a market capitalization today of about, what, 20-some billion?
Around there, yeah.
$20 billion. That's pretty good. And you own about 10% of the company?
Close to that, yeah.
So you're a happy guy?
I've been building the company for 12 and a half years. It's been a very long journey to build it,
okay.
and a company that very few people believed could achieve what it has. So I feel great about what we've been able to build. What I would say, though, and it relates to the IPO as well, is what's motivating to me is that we're actually an early stage company. This is super early in terms of what we envision being possible and what we can build. And so while the numbers or this or that are interesting or compelling for different reasons, what's exciting to me is that by becoming a publicly held institution, the general public can participate in how we build this company over the long run. And the law that even made what we do kind of enshrined in federal law and part of the global financial system just passed. And it's not even in effect. So we're in the early days of this. And so that's really motivating to me, is what we can accomplish still.
What year did you start the company?
In 2013.
And who gave you your initial capital?
So our original investors were General Catalyst, Jim Breyer, and Excel. Were the kind of founding investors.
And they made on their money?
They did well.
Well, wow, okay. And to get the Circle off the ground, it took how much capital? 10 million, 15, 20?
Yeah, I mean, in the first couple of years, we raised around $25 million.
And did people know what a stable coin was in those days?
Well, there was no such thing as a stable coin then. But when we started the company, what we explained was this new technology, cryptocurrency, blockchains, was going to make it possible to build a way to put dollars on the internet in the same way that we have protocols for how information moves around, like the web protocols or email protocols or voice protocols and all these things. There are going to be these new protocols for money on the internet that will allow very safe forms of dollars to be operated that way. And that was the idea. And you couldn't do it in 2013.
What is a stable coin, and what does Circle actually do with stable coins?
We now have a law that defines what a stablecoin is in the United States, so I'll use that definition.
Okay.
A payment stablecoin is a digital currency that is issued on the internet, on a blockchain, that is backed completely, one for one, by high quality, safe, liquid assets, so US government treasury bills and cash. And by issuing it on these networks, it allows these digital dollars to be used on the internet just like we can use any form of data and information as well. So it is a form of digital currency dollars that is fully backed and held. And it's called a stable coin because, of course, historically, cryptocurrencies were not stable and volatile, and that's really where the name came from. And Circle, we operate an internet platform across a whole range of technologies, but the core franchise is we run the largest regulated stablecoin network in the world for handling stablecoins and storing and moving them all around the internet.
Well, why do I need a stablecoin? I've been using banks for years. What's wrong with my banks? If I want to send money to Istanbul, I just tell the bank, wire the money. What's wrong with that system?
Well, if you talk to anyone who's trying to move money to Istanbul, it actually turns out it's very time-consuming, very slow. There's a lot of barriers. There tends to be excessive fees. Sometimes it gets lost. And in fact, Turkey is a great example because in Turkey, there's extraordinary demand for USDC and stablecoins right now because in a place like Turkey, people want dollars. They don't want lira. They want digital dollars that they can just use from their mobile phones, that they can, just like you can make a peer-to-peer phone call with someone, it doesn't cost you anything. People and businesses have figured out, in Turkey, just as one example, that they can transact with each other directly without an intermediary, instantly, with virtually no cost. And so it's actually becoming a substitute for banking. And in fact, the nice thing about stablecoins, especially well-regulated, well-run stablecoins, is they're very safe because they don't actually lend the money or take risk with the money. They just are holding it in these ultra-safe instruments. So holders of these are saying, wow, this is a super safe digital dollar that I can use just like I can use WhatsApp or use like the internet as a whole.
Well, if it's such a great idea, how come everybody isn't doing it? How come you don't have 1,000 competitors?
Well, historically, there actually have been hundreds of companies that have launched stablecoins. And hundreds of these have launched and are, as one of my colleagues says, stable in name only. And it's only very recently, just the past couple of years, that there have been regulations on this. We've advocated for regulations from day one, but the regulations have come into effect, and in particular in the United States, but in Japan and Hong Kong and Europe and all over the world, there's regulations on this. But once you have that regulatory clarity, then there's sort of an open, free, competitive market. And so there are a lot more companies getting involved in this now. And so we already have more competition. There's going to be a lot more competition.
10 years from today, will banks be around to wire money anywhere? Will your system take over what banks do today?
Over a 10-year period, software utilities that are built entirely on an open internet infrastructure, on the public internet with software, are going to exist and likely be as larger than the biggest banks in the world. But many of these banks will also figure out, hey, I can build on this technology too, just like media companies have made that move or communications companies have gotten involved in the internet as well.
You went public last year.
Yes.
Is that right? And your underwriters priced it at $31 a share. Is that right?
That's right.
And at the end of the day, what was the stock price?
It was around $80.
And did you think maybe they had underpriced it and you left a lot of money on the table?
When you're doing an IPO, as you know, you're trying to do a couple things. You're trying to get as broad of a base of investors involved as you can, especially major investors. We did that. We had a deal that we actually started with a price, we upsized the price multiple times, and then we priced yet again above that. We increased the size of the deal significantly, so we grew the capacity of it all the way throughout that. So we had all of these things that were happening. And then the deal was 25 times oversubscribed on roughly $1 billion, so $25 billion of demand. And so that we knew we had a great investor base, but it was really hard to know what that was going to do in the market. There hadn't been a lot of IPOs. In fact, we were like the first major IPO. The IPOs that had come hadn't been these spectacular things. So it was hard to know. There aren't many companies like this. And so I think there ended up being a lot of individuals and family offices and others that wanted to own stock. And obviously that performed very well.
Now, in the technology world, everybody in the United States always says we have to worry about the Chinese. The Chinese are going to take our technology and improve it or do something different. Is there a Chinese company that's equivalent to Circle?
There's not. And in fact, what's interesting about this space is, for those that are familiar with the kind of the early DNA of the internet, the internet has kind of open, accessible, permissionless, decentralized, open source. Like these are like the fabric of what's given the internet so much of its strength. And in fact, those ideas are inherently come out of, I would call, the liberal enlightenment. They're liberal enlightenment ideals, and they're expressed in technology and software and protocols. And I think that's intrinsic in blockchains as well. Those ideals are expressed there. And so if you're a society that is fundamentally built around centralization, total control, et cetera, and where, privacy or freedom are not the highest ideals, you don't end up building things like this.
Well, let's go back and talk about your background for a moment. Where were you born?
I was born in Philadelphia in 1971, giving my age.
Okay. And then did your family move from there?
We did. We moved when I was around 11 years old to a small town in Minnesota, Winona, Minnesota, southeastern Minnesota.
So you moved to Minnesota.
Yeah.
And you have a brother?
My brother, yes, I have a brother.
Okay. And
he's actually here today.
Where is he? Oh, there he is. Okay. Well, I see he's got the same hairline you have, right? Okay. Okay. All right. So, all right, you moved to Minnesota, and then were you a good student in school?
Yeah, I think so. I was more interested in debate and model United Nations.
All right,
government.
so you did well in high school, I assume, and then where did you go to college?
I went to McAllister College in the Twin Cities.
Walter Mondale School?
Walter Mondale, Kofi Annan, yeah.
Kofi Annan, Walter Mondale, and you. Okay, you're more famous than those guys now. Okay, all right. So after you graduated, what did you do?
So when I graduated, it was 1993. And I thought I would get a job in policy work because I did political science and philosophy. And there wasn't really easily accessible policy work. But while I was in college, I had become really obsessed with the internet. In the pre-commercial internet days, starting in like 1990, got really excited about it. And shortly after graduating college, I just said, you know what, like this is going to be the future, and I'm an internet consultant. So I decided I'm an internet consultant.
What did your parents say?
They said my dad was very concerned. he was very concerned.
An internet consultant in 1990, there wasn't much of an internet, was there?
No, I mean, there was Gopher.
Okay. All right, so you, as a consultant, did you have any clients?
I did. So I started working with, I got connected into marketing agencies, some like PC firms, others, basically, who wanted to, and this was in 1993, the very first web browser, the very first graphical web browser came out in 1993. And I got really excited that, wow, this is going to reshape how communications and media and software works. And so I just said, everyone needs to build on the web. And so I started creating web stuff
Did you have
for
clients
people.
that
I did. Yeah,
okay.
they would pay me by the hour.
By the hour?
Yes.
Okay, and did you know Steve Case then, or?
I, of course, knew Steve Case, but I didn't know him personally until much later when he invested in my next company.
Really?
Yeah.
Okay. So you started a company, another company after the internet consulting company.
Yes.
And what was that cleverly named?
Well, so that was actually a name chosen by my brother called Allaire Corporation.
Allaire Corporation.
Yes.
So
Yes.
where, was it hard to get that name?
I think we still have the domain name. We bought it from Adobe, who ended up owning the company and its assets.
All right, so you started Allaire Corporation or company. What did it do?
So Allaire built some of the very first software products to create interactive applications on the web. So in 1994, 1995, the idea was, hey, instead of building software that gets put on a personal computer, you could build software that is distributed through a web browser. And the first product, called Cold Fusion, created a very simple way for someone who was not that technical to create software programs that ran on the web.
And were you still living in Minnesota?
Yeah, in the Twin Cities.
Did anybody tell you that probably wasn't the center of the internet world at the time?
Well, our venture capital investors, in fact, said, you got to move.
So did you actually move at some point?
We did, and as the story goes, my brother and other colleagues were signing a lease in Silicon Valley in Menlo Park to move the company there, because that was where the internet was going to happen. But the venture capital firm, which was a startup VC at the time, Polaris Venture Partners, said, you know, all their kind of contacts were out on the East Coast and in the Boston area, and so we actually said, well, you know what, we'll go to Boston. We had East Coast heritage, as you know, some of the founders, my brother and I, and we thought, you know, building a company, a tech software company there will sort of be easier than being crowded out in a place like
so you moved to Boston.
Yes.
How big did the company become?
So that company grew to over 100 million in revenue, went public in early 1999.
So when the great internet bubble burst occurred in 98, 99, 2000, what happened to your company?
We had a great franchise, meaning we had an incredibly loyal customer base, and over time, literally millions of developers used our software to build websites and applications. And we decided to merge with another internet software company called Macromedia that made some of the most popular tools for building the web and building content on the web. We merged the companies together, two public companies
And what was it then called? Allaire Macromedia?
Well, that was just Macromedia. I mean, effectively, they acquired.
So you gave up the Allaire name?
Yes.
Okay, and how long did you stay at Macromedia?
For about 2 years.
Really? Okay, and then when you left, what did you do next?
Well, so while I was at Macromedia, I was the chief technology officer, and we released into the market technology called Flash. Many of you probably remember Flash Player. You couldn't use the internet without using Flash Player. Thank you.
All right.
We actually, in 2002, put the best video technology that the internet had ever seen into Flash. And within a year, every computer in the world, 98% of computers in the world, could play back video more smoothly. And I got very excited about this. And I got excited that there's going to be a video publishing revolution, and that every person, every business, every media company could be transformed, and essentially television would move to the internet. And so this was in 2002. In 2003, I left and then went as an entrepreneur in residence at General Catalyst,
which is a venture capital firm.
Venture capital firm in Cambridge at the time. And they were a startup VC really then. And incubated this idea, and then founded it officially in 2004.
That company was?
Brightcove. Brightcove grew over the next half a decade. We had a successful IPO in 2012, and the company powered many of the television and media streaming infrastructures for a lot of media companies, major brands, and others.
So you took two companies public. That's a lot. And so is Brightcove now been bought by somebody else, or?
It has been. It's a private equity firm, took it private.
Okay.
Yeah.
So after that company was bought or sold?
So I took Brightcove public in early 2012, right. And I got immersed in this whole technology of crypto later in 2012. And then I stepped down as CEO in the beginning of 2013, and then I started Circle. When I started the company, I told the early employees and the early board members and investors, this is like a 10 to 20 year thing to accomplish what we think we can accomplish. And now when I look at where we are, where I kind of see the progression of this technology and the future impact, and I'm like, there's another 10 to 20 years here. So I'm trying to build a very long-lasting institution, and I think it can be fundamental to changing not just the financial system, but the way the broader economic system works. Over the next 10 years, there are going to be very significant internet financial platform companies that are major utilities for the way the financial and economic system work, and we hope to be one of those. We're working on that.
All right, so let me ask you, I want to know about the future, because the future is where I want to invest. So is artificial intelligence going to be good for society, and are people going to lose their jobs, or are people going to get more jobs because of artificial intelligence?
It's very likely, in my view, that artificial intelligence is going to pretty dramatically disrupt the labor market as we know it today. And it's going to, I think there's huge numbers of human labor jobs that will be replaced by AI.
Not private equity, though.
Never.
Never.
Never. Never.
Not.
No. I do think that there's going to be a huge amount of displacement from AI, and at the same time, and this is what I tell all of my employees, we have a very aggressive AI adoption posture in our company, and what I've told every employee in the company is, you want to become really good at using these tools. It's sort of like when personal computers came out, you could have chosen to learn how to use a spreadsheet or a word processor, or when the internet came out, you could have chosen to decide to figure out all this stuff. These are choices that people make, and in their careers, they have to make these choices. Now, not everyone has that opportunity, so I'm obviously it's different because I'm sort of shepherding this, but my view is that the capabilities that humans will have and do have already through the application of AI are extraordinary, and will continue to be extraordinary. And so human capital and AI labor are gonna work closely together And it's that orchestration of that is going to be some of the highest value labor that's out there.
What about quantum computing? Is that the next wave of the future? Is that going to happen?
All of the fundamental infrastructure that we run on is built on cryptography. Crypto is cryptography, and it's applied cryptography, and it uses cryptography for security. It uses cryptography for kind of systems to prove data and other things. And so cryptography and the resilience of cryptography is a really critical thing. And so when people think about quantum, one of the first things they think about is breaking cryptography. And if you can break cryptography, then all bets are off, right? You can just pour into an energy grid, or you could take over banks, you could do whatever. Okay. And so as we build our systems, we're studying what is quantum cryptography going to look like? What is quantum resistant cryptography going to look like? And we're actively working on engineering and working in communities that are working on quantum resistant tech. Now, when people sort of say, well, what's the time horizon on that? You hear a lot of different estimates on that. But I think we feel compelled that in 2026 and 2027, we need to have infrastructure that is quantum ready, if you will, from a security perspective. Okay. So I don't know what that means in terms of when it's available. Obviously, the implications are extraordinary in terms of this scale of compute and what it could be applied in. And I think obviously when you think about quantum in coordination with other technology things that we have going on, it's pretty interesting.
You know technology well. So this example, I'm using what I call a last adopter. I'm still trying to use a BlackBerry, but then nobody else wants to use them. So what do you use for technology? How many computers do you have? Do you have iPads? How many smartphones you use? And how often do you spend how many hours a day do you spend looking at your screens?
I use an iPhone. I use tablets, I use laptops, and I have a variety of those, and some that I will use strictly for personal reasons and others for work.
But you should be worried about people hacking you. So
absolutely.
So you have a pretty good anti-hacking system?
We have a lot of cybersecurity.
What do you want most people to leave here tonight knowing about Circle?
I would say a couple things. I think the first is that we're still in the very early days of this technology. And while the aggregate numbers sound really big, there's trillions of dollars of transactions and all this stuff. We're really in the early days. And if you think about what Circle's trying to do, we're not just our stablecoin network. We're building a whole set of infrastructure, operating system infrastructure, platforms for developers, these monetary systems, and utilities to use all of this. And our view is that over the next 10 years, there are going to be, just like we've had internet platform companies that came up for, say, communications or for digital media or for selling products and services or for mobile handsets and other things, we believe that over the next 10 years, there are going to be very significant internet financial platform companies that are major utilities for the way the financial and economic system work. And we hope to be one of those. We're working on that.